As a doctoral candidate and as a sort of watchdog for creationism here online, every now and again I get to bear witness to one of the rarest events in nature. I'm talking about mainstream creationism changing their mind on something. And for the better, too, in line with the conventional science.
Wow, that's almost impossible.
Well, first of all, through God, all things are possible, so jot that down.
I guess it's sort of feast or famine with that, though, because the last time we saw this happen was actually earlier this year, with creationists moving over to accept the more conventional number for the human-chimpanzee genomic similarity estimate. Regrettably, this W was horrifically transmogrified into an L thanks to Casey Luskin, but you can hear about that in all of these places.
Aw, dang it.
Now, the human-chimpanzee genomic similarity has sort of become a pet issue for me. I'm not a geneticist. I'm actually a fifth-year PhD candidate in human evolution, so biological anthropology, but what I study is Miocene apes, specifically the sexual dimorphism of their canine teeth. So I guess what I actually am right now is a paleoprimatologist, or tangentially a paleoanthropologist. I studied the fossil remains of human relatives, close-ish ones, I should be clear, because everything's related. Naturally, the 16 other people globally who like and enjoy Miocene apes are rejoicing at hearing me reiterate that, but it's actually extremely relevant for today, as you'll soon see. First, there are hominins that are Miocene apes. The Miocene ends around 5.3 million years ago, so we're including the earliest hominins there, who we'll talk a little bit more about later. But two, I study the sexual dimorphism of canines, and I'll add their absolute size and shape. And the reduction in the canine teeth and the loss of any sexual dimorphism is a trait that characterizes hominins to the exclusion of other great apes, or hominids. It's a very early transition too. Some would argue the first. The features that I study clock early hominins, and the entire process takes until the end of the ape-men-looking hominins, from Sahelanthropus chilensis to the first members of genus Homo. That means I spent a lot of time, even formally for my dissertation, reading about and looking at Australopithecus, the genus. So I know a lot about apes and about ape men. And while I focus on their canines and their CP3 honing complex, I also know a lot about them generally because I have to. I'm also a watchdog for creationism here online. I debunk creationism, young Earth creationism, old Earth creationism, intelligent design. So, not for nothing, but I think I'm kind of the perfect person to do what we're going to be doing today. In this video, I'm going to walk you through Peter Line's appearance on major creationist organization, Creation Ministries International. We're going to talk about the inaccuracies of that video and sort of tie them to the major mistakes that creationists have and continue to make on hominins, but we are going to highlight what I see as a major paradigm shift in a big creationist organization, accepting critical aspects of human evolution. Specifically, in this case, they've finally given up the ghost on arguing that genus Australopithecus, Lucy's genus, were just knuckle-walking chimps. They accept that they were bipedal, like us. And they are not the only ones. Let's get into it. I just realized my beanie's got me looking kind of like Lindsay Nicole in this bad boy. Longtime followers of this channel will remember when, a few years ago, I went to the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter. The Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter are two large-scale, sort of tourist attractions found in Kentucky. They were created by Answers in Genesis, a young Earth creationist organization helmed by the famous Ken Ham, who I actually met when I visited all those years ago.
God, that was honestly the worst time of my life.
I made a video about my experience, basically documenting everything incorrect, scientifically speaking, with these two attractions, and that was a lot of stuff. But as someone who studies human evolution, the most profane, if you will, of the exhibits was the one that tackled the hominins, where it depicted Lucy's species, Australopithecus afarensis, as a knuckle-walking chimp. So you can't actually just do this, right? The way an organism moves regularly is constrained by how its body is set up via its bones, muscles, etc. In the same way that you can't force a human skeleton to be an obligate quadruped or something that walks around on all fours all the time, you can't force Lucy's genus to be knuckle-walking chimpanzees. Their anatomy won't allow it. It is, morphologically, an impossible interpretation. More on this later, but given anatomists and medical doctors have worked with Answers in Genesis, and I certainly hope consulted regarding their Creation Museum and their Ark Encounter, there's no excuse for this interpretation of that genus's locomotor style. And to me, that makes it dishonest. And this is still the position held by Answers in Genesis and related organizations like the Institute for Creation Research or Genesis Apologetics. To them, there is no excuse for accepting human evolution because actually all of the hominin fossil record can be divvied out into two distinct created categories that God divinely originated approximately 6,000 years ago in the Garden of Eden. The fully ape group and the fully human group, because they don't accept that humans are apes. And by that virtue, none of the hominins that fall in the ape group or the human group actually have characteristics that bridge that gap. None of the apes can be bipedal, none of the apes can have big brains, none of the apes can use complex stone tools. All of the humans are bipedal, all of the humans have big brains compared to other living apes, and all of the humans used complex stone tools. It is distinctly binary for them. And while it is, scientifically speaking, completely indefensible, as we'll soon see, it does make sense. Human evolution is the idea that humans descend from more basal or primitive apes, and that those apes descended from more primitive catarrhine monkeys, and that those monkeys descended from more primitive mammals, and so on and so forth. Human evolution thus nests within the larger concept of common descent for all life on Earth. Human evolution then makes a critical core prediction. This is the idea that underpins the entire concept, and that is this. If humans descend from more basal or primitive apes over long periods of geologic time, we should find those transitions. We should see slow morphologic change over long geologic time. We should see the accumulation of the characteristics that make humans unique from other apes today emerge over slow geologic time in various species and specimens of progressively less ape-like and progressively more human-like hominins. And we know what those characteristics are. We can look at how modern humans differ from other living apes and how modern humans differ from the Miocene apes to determine which characteristics human evolution requires us to find emerge slowly over geologic time. Those characteristics are these. Number 1, big brains. Number 2, walking upright and the physical characteristics that allow or facilitate that type of locomotion. 3, small, non-honing, monomorphic canine teeth. 4, an extended time to maturity. We take a long time to grow up. And 5, a broad diet and tool culture. For human evolution to be true, those characteristics must emerge over geologic time. We have to see them show up in progressively more derived or modern hominin fossils. That is a distinct prediction made by human evolution and evolutionary theory, and only by human evolution and evolutionary theory generally. Creationism does not predict that we should see this. In this light, you can understand why Answers in Genesis and other such organizations take the position that they do, because Australopithecus, the genus, according to conventional science, is a small-brained, bipedal, little canine tool user that was quick to grow up. It is a perfect transitional genus between the Miocene apes and anatomically modern humans. And of all of those characteristics, the bipedalism of Australopithecus is perhaps the most problematic because it requires hundreds of major and minor musculoskeletal changes all across the body. And the bodies of Australopithecus show an animal quite literally in transition. Individual bones are themselves midway points between earlier Miocene apes and anatomically modern humans, and the animal as a whole was at home on the ground on two legs and also in the trees. This is a major problem because this is precisely what evolution predicted and what creationism promised would never be found. This is easily demonstrated historically. When you look at the writings of Price and Whitcomb and Morris and Gish, these guys said there's no such thing as a transitional, we will never find a transitional, and this was an easy thing to do at that time when the fossils that we had weren't really very impressive. There was scrappy material from South Africa postcranially and essentially the Lucy specimen, and not much else. But the same cannot be said now. Now we have thousands of individual fossils belonging to hundreds of specimens that demonstrate in jaw-dropping detail an animal in transition through transitional fossils and transitional species, some of which are partially complete and some of which are completely complete. Well, 94% complete. Obviously, because of this, the Australopiths are just knuckle-walking chimps or something equivalent to that position is no longer viable at all. You can't even pretend that this is a viable position to have. And so, many creationists slowly but surely have moved over to a new position. I've talked about the creationists who have accepted the conventional position of a bipedal Australopithecus genus before on this channel. Namely, it comes from Todd Wood and the New Creation blog. But this creationist organization is much smaller and has gotten a ton of flack from mainstream creationist organizations like Answers in Genesis, to the degree that Answers in Genesis had like an entire hit piece about them in their Young Earth Evolutionist series. Their idea was that Australopithecus is, as conventional scientists interpret it, it is a bipedal ape that has many characteristics that do appear to span the gap between Miocene apes and modern humans, but that isn't actually what it is. Instead, it is a separately created kind. Just as there are knuckle-walking apes that God created in the Garden of Eden, there are bipedal apes that God created in the Garden of Eden, the Australopiths, and these are distinct from humans, who are the only animals made in the image of God. But like I said, they got absolutely bodied for this by the mainstream major young Earth creationist organizations like AIG and ICR because this was deemed as an unnecessary evolutionary compromise.
Antichrist, he's not nice. Take his mark, you'll pay the price.
Obviously, it isn't. They are following the anatomy. They are correct in their functional interpretation of these animals. But it didn't matter that they were right. Ken Ham hit them with the compromiser brand, and so they've been the minority position amongst young Earth creationists for a pretty long time. Until just this past month, when Peter Line, a young Earth creationist neuroanatomist or neurologist, I believe, went on the CMI or Creation Ministries International YouTube channel. That's the third big YEC organization, certainly very mainstream for young Earth creationists, and said that, yeah, Australopiths might have been bipedal. In fact, they probably were.
That evolutionists say they were upright walkers. They walk upright. And in some ways, that if you look at their pelvis and the femur, the thigh bone in some of them, it was kind of angled more inward, so that they likely walk better upright than existing chimps.
And on top of that, YouTube creationists such as Donny of Standing for Truth are now completely abandoning the idea that Australopithecus is some kind of knuckle walker, or that they're just pygmy humans, or that it's a mixture of human and ape fossils, and instead saying that, yeah, Australopiths were probably bipedal, and that there's a wealth of data to support this idea.
We're going to see that, yes, they walked upright, but not quite in the same unique manner as humans.
Now, both Peter Line and Donny are emphatic that this is not problematic for young Earth creationism. I don't think that's true, obviously, and we'll talk about that more later, but you need to understand just how huge this is. Mainstream creationism has been so sure for so long that Australopiths were just knuckle-walking chimps, essentially, that it was the centerpiece of the human evolution exhibit at the Creation Museum, which is the museum run by the biggest young Earth creationist organization, Answers in Genesis, remember?
Unfriendly reminder.
To concede this, and it is a concession historically, is a big deal and it's a good thing. Like, I watched hours and hours of Donny's content on Australopithecus, his recent stuff, talking about how creationists should interpret genus Australopithecus, and I'm not kidding, it is the most correct and the best content that I have seen from him, period. And it's not close. Now, granted, he's getting a lot of his information from Peter Line and from me.
Critics such as Gutsick Gibbon, who focuses a lot on the topic of hominin fossils and the Australopithecines, watching her lectures, watching her videos, has helped me to see which arguments don't work, which points are not that strong, and how our explanation of the hominin fossil record can be refined.
But correct is correct, and I am happy to say that Peter Line, CMI, and the Standing for Truth channel are all objectively more correct by a lot than mainstream organizations like Answers in Genesis or ICR are. But more correct is not completely correct. And while their new model, which we're going to explore here in a moment, is leaps and bounds better than the slop that we're seeing at AIG, it still has a lot of problems that are intrinsically linked to the fact that they're young Earth creationists. And then there is the glaring issue, the big elephant in the room, that this is an accommodation by the more scientifically literate creationists. This was not a prediction made in the time of Darwin, as Darwin did with all of human evolution, the predictions of which, that slow morphologic change over geologic time, we have seen come to fruition over the decades and centuries. Saying we have a new model and this new model predicts that we should see all of the stuff that we've already discovered, that is not equal to predicting something decades or centuries ago and then having that come to pass over hundreds of thousands of people individually studying this subject. If you were to gamify this, making your model so that it accommodates data you previously rejected gets like 1 point. But predicting that data before it was actually discovered decades or centuries prior, that's like 1,000 points in favor of your model. It's often said that predictions, and specifically accurate predictions, are the gold standard of science. It's a sign that your model is really on the right track. And this fulfilled prediction, slow morphologic change over geologic time seen in the hominin fossil record, is a gargantuan, a colossal, just a massive win for evolutionary theory. It's exactly what we said we would find, and then we went and found it. And no creationist accommodation of that will diminish that fulfilled prediction as supporting evolutionary theory in a very major way. We're going to start with Peter Line's CMI video. We're going to go over some of the parts that are correct and the parts that are incorrect in that, and we're going to finish with some of the primary points that Donny makes, and we're going to explain why, while they're on the right track, short of abandoning young Earth creationism in favor of theistic evolution, they're still up a creek here with hominins. And it all boils down to this central challenge that they are trying to meet. How do you separate the Australopithecus kind from the human kind and from the non-human ape kind? Because really, the only way, and it's a major way to be fair, in which these guys, Peter Line and Donny in the New Creation blog, differ from AIG is in the addition of one single additional kind. AIG says all of the hominins can be divvied out into two distinct created kinds, the ape kind and the human kind, and there's nothing that bridges that gap. Whereas all of our more progressive guys here are saying, no, all of the hominin fossils can actually be distributed into three distinct created kinds, the non-human ape kind, the Australopith kind, and the human kind. And their argument is thus, there's nothing that bridges the gap between the Australopith kind and the human kind, or to a lesser extent, the non-human ape kind and the Australopith kind. They are wrong on that. Let's get into why. The video starts by doing that thing I hate where they're like, coming up next in this video with a bunch of clips, but the clips that they used are interesting.
We are told that there are thousands of examples in our museums of our anthropological history. Why do you disagree?
There may be thousands of fossils showcased in museums and other places, but everybody knows fossils are fickle. Bones will sing any song you want. It all depends on which worldview lenses you view the fossil evidence through.
Well, that's just not true. There are aspects of paleontology that are up for interpretation. Those are usually the areas that are rife with debate, but the majority of the field is down to brute measurements of bones and other remains and functional anatomy derived from that. For example, I can't look at a human skull in this case, and say that the brain case size of this animal was actually 300 cc's, the size of an orange, because we have the brain case size, we can measure it, and it's not the size of an orange. You see what I mean? Likewise, if we turn it over, that foramen magnum or hole at the base of the skull is at the bottom of the cranium and shunted forward or anteriorly, which means we can't interpret this as belonging to a quadruped. If it belonged to a quadruped, humans would be looking down all the time. The fact that it's tucked up underneath tells us that they walked upright and that we continue to walk upright. And this goes more than one direction. We can't take the skull of a cat or some kind of felid and interpret it to have the brain case size of a human, or for that matter, a bipedal style of locomotion. Look at that hole at the base of the skull, exiting posteriorly or from behind. A bipedal cat would be staring up all the time, and that wouldn't be very good for hunting, would it? An example of what Line is talking about here might be exemplified in this hypothetical. Let's say an alien species came to Earth and discovered the remains of humans long after we've gone extinct. They could look at the anatomy of a human and say, wow, this was an animal that walked upright on the ground. But it also has aspects of anatomy that allow it to be pretty good in the trees. For example, powerful legs, arms that we can hold directly above our head, and strong grips. So the alien species might look at the human skeleton and say, I wonder how much time this creature spent on the ground as compared to the trees, given its anatomy allows it to be decent at both. That question is tough to answer even today because though humans spend the vast majority of time on the ground, we are pretty good in the trees, as exemplified by foraging groups who still forage for food up in the trees today. And this was probably a much higher number of people in the past before the development of things like agriculture. So that might be a debate that the alien species could have amongst themselves. Is this a bipedal creature that sometimes goes in the trees, or an arboreal creature that sometimes comes to the ground? They could answer this question by looking at aspects of human anatomy that change based off of what we're actually doing as compared to what we're born with. So humans that spend more time climbing around, like gymnasts or more arboreal foragers, will have slightly more curved fingers than those of us who spend all of our time on the ground. This is in accordance with Wolff's law, where bones remodel themselves in response to stressors. And it actually works for a lot of cases. You can clock a tennis player just by x-raying both their arms. It also doesn't depend on your worldview. The anatomy is what the anatomy is. If the anatomy tells us that the animal was a quadruped, it was a quadruped. There's no way to interpret it otherwise. Likewise with bipedalism. And likewise for testing the evolutionary hypothesis here. Does the fossil records show slow morphologic change through geologic time or not? Your worldview lens is not going to make a difference with regard to that question. And we'll see more of this in a second. So no, bones won't sing any song you want them to sing. What's weirder about this intro is the next thing that Line says.
If you really want to disprove evolution, go inside the fossil's head and then look at the brain, look at the complex biochemical machinery inside there, where God's not just his fingerprints, but his hands are all over it.
This makes sense given his background, I guess, but the odd thing about this is that what you just saw is basically the extent to which Peter Line talks about neuroanatomy and human exceptionalism in that area in this video. The rest is just about fossils. So I don't really know why he brought it up other than to be like, look, if you didn't find all this convincing, trust me, there's other stuff that can make it clear that humans are separately created critters made in the image of God. I'm not going to talk about them here, but, trust me. The intro sums things up pretty succinctly, I think, and it's very high quality.
Can you take us through a summary of what you've shown us?
So the whole story boils down to, was this human or not?
Basically, this is what we already said. Can you discretely group Australopithecus specimens into one group and human specimens into another group with no major overlap? If you can draw a neat line, that doesn't preclude evolution, but it's at least consistent with this new modified creation model of the Australopiths being their own separately created kind. That is to say, if there's a cluster of specimens which kind of bridge the gap between the Australopiths and the humans, say late Australopithecus or early genus Homo, then you have a really big problem as a creationist. Our host here seems quite lovely, but she does not start out strong.
We've all seen it. It's in all the textbooks and the documentaries. The march of progress, where we see the ape progressing eventually to modern humans. But does the evidence really stack up for this evolutionary story?
This was actually a clever play by Peter Line and the boys over there at CMI because I actually took psychic damage from seeing this image. It hopefully goes without saying if you're even tangentially interested in human evolution or if you've been to my channel before, but the March of Progress has not been popular for like many decades, probably since around its inception. It overly simplifies human evolution and it gives it a very anagenetic, orthogenetic perspective, which is not correct. Human evolution is better represented by a bush, by many different lineages, some of which were successful, some of which were not. Human evolution works just like the evolution of any group of organisms. There's going to be experiments, there are going to be dead ends, and there are many ways to be a hominin and many ways to be a human. We've learned that since, we've discovered so many fossils. So I will answer Jess's question here. No, the evidence does not support the March of Progress, which is fine because no one alive is proposing that the March of Progress accurately depicts human evolution. Much worse than that, though, is the depiction of Proconsul there at the beginning as this, partially bipedal ape. That's not what Proconsul was like. Proconsul is a Miocene ape that used to include several other species within it. Now Proconsul has been split into genus Proconsul and genus Ikembo, but both of these very closely related genera of early hominoid were like above branch, pronograde, palmograde quadrupeds. That means that they walked on all fours on the palms of their hands and the soles of their feet in the trees. They don't have any aspects to them that lend themselves to a more upright posture or any kind of even partial bipedalism. That comes a lot later in hominoid and then hominid and then hominin evolution. So I'm not really sure why it's being presented like this. You can say I'm being pedantic, but that's my job, is to point out when stuff like this is not correct. I'm nitpicking because that's how science is supposed to be. Jess asks Peter to define what an ape man is.
So, Peter, what actually is an ape man?
And Peter responds with basically the definition for hominins. Hominins are any ape that is more closely related to humans than it is to our closest living relatives, the chimps and bonobos, after our split roughly 7 million years ago. And Peter articulates this generally.
The line or lineage leading to humans, they call ape men.
But the last time anybody used the term ape man was like the last time anybody thought the March of Progress was a legitimate representation of evolution. It was decades and decades and decades and decades ago. So I don't know why he's saying that the conventional scientific community uses that term at all, because I have never met anybody who does.
They don't really like using that term anymore. I'm not sure why, but
this isn't true. He actually does know why, and he articulates it later in this interview. The reason why ape man is no longer used is because in the middle of the 1900s, we discovered that humans and chimpanzees are genetically more similar to one another than either is to gorillas, and that ruined the current taxonomic classification of apes versus humans. It used to be that amongst the apes, there were 3 families: Hylobatidae, the gibbons, Pongidae, the great apes, and Hominidae, the humans. But that genetic discovery revealed that humans and chimps were one another's closest living relatives, so they couldn't be split into Pongidae and Hominidae and maintain a monophyletic group at all. So all of the great apes were lumped in with humans into a single family called Hominidae. Ape man fell for a similar reason, because saying ape man is like saying canine dog. Dogs are canines, humans are apes. All of that was deduced on the basics of genetics and has held through as we've come up with multiple complete genomes for members of all of these species.
I use the term ape man, so I'm just saying they don't like it because they want to be sort of more politically correct, you know.
Immediately before this, and I cut it out, he talks about why the change actually happened due to reclassification. And that reclassification happened on the basis of genetics. So no, it's not about being politically correct, Dr. Line. It's about being regular correct. To be clear, when you sequence the entire genome multiple times of all of the members of Hominidae, all of the great apes, there is no way to separate out humans exclusively. Humans are apes. That's just factual. If you want to argue otherwise at this point, because of the glut of our data set, you have to argue that humans aren't apes on the basis of some non-quantifiable, non-scientific, spiritual reason, which is fine as long as you accept that it isn't scientific. So next, Jess poses a challenge to Peter Line. She's like, I remember when I was a kid, people talked about how the evidence for evolution was overwhelming and how we just have so many fossils. And Peter Line responds by saying, yes, it's true. When you talk to paleoanthropologists, they'll talk about how we've got tens of thousands of fossils, but...
Tens of thousands.
Yeah.
Sounds very convincing.
Yeah. It sounds very convincing, and that's what they're relying that the public will buy into it. But it may not be so convincing when, firstly, a lot of them are just fossil fragments, sometimes of the same creature or human. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, if someone else can have a different interpretation of them, interpret it differently, using a different worldview lenses, as not that these creatures are not hominin or ape men. Tim White calls them hominids. Then that sort of nullifies the evidence. So
Dr. Line is like, yes, there are tens of thousands, but one, a lot of them are very fragmentary, which that's true, but a lot of them also aren't very fragmentary. We've got complete skeletons of these things found in articulation. And then he says, but so long as there are different interpretations, the evidence is, and he uses the word nullified here. That is not true. You could use the same logic with flat earthers right now. They take a different interpretation on the data that tell us the Earth is a globe. But that doesn't mean that they are valid, nor does it nullify the evidence for the globe, because their interpretation is demonstrably incorrect. And the same is true for the creationist understanding of our hominins, as we'll soon see. In sum, it's not good enough to have an alternative explanation. The alternative has to be able to stand on its own, and it has to be accurate in and of itself. Peter goes on to argue that things are not as they seem. Once you take a closer look, it's not as convincing as, they might have you believe.
So, because when you critically examine a lot of these fossils, things sort of rapidly tend to fall apart.
He articulates correctly that evolution is not anagenetic and that it's a branching pattern.
But you still have to have some creature evolving into this, which then evolves into that.
This is the story of evolution.
Yeah. So on the table here, I have a sort of...
Dr. Line has several crania there before him that he's going to continue to reference throughout the remainder of the interview. The first is a large male Australopithecus afarensis, AL444-2. The second is the type specimen for Homo rudolfensis, which he's going to be calling Homo habilis, which is an interpretation that exists. It's KNM ER 1470, and the third is KNM ER 3733, which is a smaller brained member of African Homo erectus sensu-lato, or what we might call Homo ergaster. Essentially, he's created a small sort of mini potential march of progress, because it is true that most paleoanthropologists, myself included, will tell you that Australopithecus, the genus, beget genus Homo, and the earliest members of genus Homo were really primitive, and then the later members of genus Homo weren't. And you could theoretically pick the three that he has picked here, although I probably would have picked different ones. For example, for models like that, when scale actually matters, I would include a male and a female representative of genus Australopithecus. He's got a big male there. The reason I say this is because males and females are dimorphic in this genus, and so it would be helpful to see the smaller, more gracile female crania contrasted with the bigger, more robust male crania. I also probably would have picked K&M ER 1813 for Homo habilis, which is the most complete cranium that requires no reconstruction at all. Oddly, we don't ever see that particular specimen, 1813, the Homo habilis most complete cranium, and I find that kind of weird for reasons that are going to become clear later. But to be clear, if it were me, I would have males and females for Afarensis ready to show, and I would have 1813 and 1470 ready for early genus Homo. As for Homo erectus, I think that specimen's fine. Next, Line argues that not all evolutionists think that Australopiths were actually ancestral to genus Homo. There's one guy, Charles Oxnard, who proposes that instead it was a group that was as different from humans as it was from African apes, and ought to be best considered sort of off on its own as a dead end within primates.
But with, for instance, the Australopithecines, even some evolutionists like Charles Oxnard believed that they were just an extinct apish primate group. They were differed from both African apes and humans when he analysed the Australopithecines sort of almost equally or even more. And these had nothing to do with human evolution.
So obviously that goes into an ad, and I will let you know that he's going to continue to call Australopiths apish primates and not actually apes, because Dr. Line is using that old convention where non-human apes are members of Ponchidae, humans are not apes at all, and thus with that convention the hominins aren't apes either, or at the very least they aren't great apes. I would imagine that even in that old convention they're still classified as hominoids, so technically what he's saying here still isn't correct, but just for your information. What he says about Charles Oxnard there is true, but what he doesn't say is that that was a paper that was put out in 1975, before the overwhelming majority of our fossil specimens were actually discovered, and even then, with the motley collection that we had, his results were not well received. In fact, Oxnard's work was systematically deconstructed in a paper by Howell and colleagues just a few years later, and these authors pointed out some issues. They pointed out that Oxnard's analysis was plagued by its sample. He used a small number of highly fragmentary fossils, which probably explained his results, particularly in the face of the exact opposite result being achieved by almost 30 other investigators looking at every available bone representing the entire skeleton. I struggle to understand why Dr. Line would invoke this paper, given it is 50 years old, has been systematically deconstructed by other paleoanthropologists with very good reason, and was based off of a sample that is now dwarfed by the current fossil record that we have accumulated since then. And our much larger current data set supports the conventional idea that yes, Australopithecus is actually ancestral to genus Homo. Dr. Line starts with Australopithecus.
If you look at that, there's nothing really human looking at. If you look at the skull, there's nothing really human about it. It's very apish.
And we already have problems. Before we get into that though, I think this background could be a little bit more subject appropriate, don't you? All of these animals, well, most of these animals lived far too recently. Ta-da! No, wait. Ta-da! See, I moved my chair up so that you can see the actual lines of skulls and crania here. And also I got 2 new crania because it's been 2 weeks. And luckily for us, these new crania are eminently relevant to today's conversation. First, we have the preserved face of Pierolopithecus catalonicus, a Miocene ape from about 12 to 13 million years ago. And second, we have the essentially fully preserved cranium of Australopithecus anamensis from about 3.8 million years ago. This is the first oldest Australopithecus species, and we got the full thing. So, with your permission, I would like to go through some of the craniofacial and craniodental characteristics of some of these guys and see if what Dr. Line says...
There's nothing really human looking at. If you look at the skull, there's nothing really human about it. It's very apish.
...is actually correct. Welcome to the Gutsick Gibbon Anatomy Lab, where dead things are repurposed and the only aesthetic is the 1800s gentleman naturalist aesthetic. Hey there, I hope you like the background. It's composed of things that I've collected over the years and also gifts that I've received from relatives and friends who think I have an old soul. That's their way of saying that they'll only buy me things that are dead, or a rock, or in some kind of earth tone. I am aware now that you can't really see any of it, and that you can't really see me either. I'm really giving like Miss Bellum from the Powerpuff Girls here, but that's fine, because I don't want to distract anyways from the actual important stuff, which is the bones. Luckily, I talk a lot with my hands, at least according to the people that complain about it. Here we have a common chimpanzee male and the face of Paralopithecus catalonicus. The reason I'm starting with these two next to each other, despite the fact that this is a living ape rather than a Miocene ape, is just to demonstrate for you how similar these two guys are craniofacially and craniodentally. It doesn't take a genius or a trained anatomist to see that these two are very similar with regard to their face shape, and yet there are subtle differences that are pretty important. The chimpanzee's got a deeper sulcus behind this brow ridge here, or supraorbital torus, that's lacking in this Paralopithecus catalonicus specimen, despite the fact that they both have pretty strong brow ridges. If you turn them to the side, you can see that Paralopithecus is actually less prognathic or less snouty than modern chimpanzees are, and that Paralopithecus's canine teeth aren't just larger, but they appear to be, if we flip them upside down, slightly more broad at the base. They're less bilaterally compressed. Keeping them flipped over, differences in the palate are evident if you know where to look. While they both have that primitive rectangular shape to them, as opposed to the parabolic palate that we see in humans, Paralopithecus's palate almost looks as if it's been pinched in, bowing the dental arcade on either side inwards towards the midline or mesially. In the case of chimpanzees, we see that more balloonish but still rectangular palate. The teeth also differ. We see cuspier molars that are also overall larger in Paralopithecus as compared to chimpanzees, which probably represents a difference in the diet between these two individuals. These cuspier molars are usually associated with folivory or leaf eating, and at least to my eye, these look a lot more similar to what we would see in gorillas as compared to chimps, which are more frugivorous and omnivorous. Bringing a human into the mix is what really accentuates the differences here. In chimpanzees, we have a really strong brow ridge, really big canine teeth, a very prognathic or snouty face, in comparison to a human who has a really weak brow ridge, if any at all, teeny tiny canine teeth, and a not very snouty face. We call this orthognathic or flat-faced. The Paralopithecus specimen here is pretty obviously on the chimp side of things. I don't think that that's going to be controversial. So in between this guy and this guy, we should see the emergence of all of this guy's characteristics. No? Rest in peace if you're listening to this in the car. Rewatch it later because there's a lot of good visuals here. We're more focused on Australopithecus today, so I'm going to sort of skip through some of our earliest hominins, but from Sahelanthropus and Ardipithecus from 7 to 4.4 million years ago, we see a reduction in the canine tooth size, a loss of the canine P3 honin complex, which is present in Paralopithecus and all other living apes other than humans, and of course, we see that foramen magnum, or the hole at the base of the skull, shift forward, implying a more upright or orthograde posture, which is of course a necessary prerequisite for bipedalism. In case you want to see the difference, we'll use our chimpanzee as the stand-in here due to its similarities with Paralopithecus. We see a much less anterior or forwardly placed foramen magnum that is also angled more backwards because chimpanzees are knuckle walkers, so their head sort of comes out at an angle like this behind the body. This is MRD, or the Australopithecus anamensis specimen from about 3.8 million years ago, the oldest Australopithecus anamensis cranium that we have, and the first member of the Australopithecus genus. So let's see how this thing, which is older than the Australopithecus specimen that we see Peter Line have, compares to earlier hominids and also to extant, more basal or primitive hominids, at least with respect to Homo sapiens. At first glance, MRD looks very similar to a chimpanzee with regard to the face, looking at it from the front, or even from the side, especially if we're comparing it to something like Homo sapiens. But in many measurements, and measurements do matter if we're trying to clock slow morphologic change over geologic time, align MRD more with humans or with Australopiths than it does earlier Miocene apes, or even earlier hominins like Sahelanthropus or Ardipithecus. Some of these facial measurements are difficult to show with my models here, so I'll throw up some figures from papers concerning this particular cranium to demonstrate what I mean with regard to this specific specimen mapping more with later hominins having some more evolved characteristics with relation to the face and neurocranium than earlier hominins. But there are some characteristics that you can very easily see just by comparing these models. And of course, my favorite and the most obvious is the canine teeth. Again, you don't have to be a trained anatomist to see that the canine tooth of Australopithecus anamensis here, and we have many more isolated canines assigned to this species, is much, much smaller than what we see in current chimpanzees, and especially compared to some of our Miocene apes, like Pierolopithecus catalonicus, for example. In addition, anamensis is proposed to have a deeper palate, which is considered to be a more derived characteristic. In addition, while the brain case size is still relatively small, the prognathism or relative snoutiness of these earliest hominins is already starting to push it more in the direction of Homo sapiens. This is kind of tough to see just looking at them side by side at this angle. But in profile, it's abundantly clear that a reduction in the snoutiness is already evident in the first members of Australopithecus. The midface is the first region to get flatter, with the subnasal region lagging behind. We would expect from an evolutionary perspective for those characteristics emerging in Australopithecus anamensis to continue onward and exacerbate further still in the next hominin, Australopithecus afarensis, or Lucy's species. And in fact, that is exactly what we see. This is a composite female 3D print of Australopithecus afarensis. So a composite means that this is sort of the general shape of the cranium pulled from many different partial crania or nearly complete crania of this genus and then of this species in particular. Now, that it's a female is important because that explains why it's lacking this sagittal crest and why it appears less robust than the one that we're looking at with Peter Line. I'm going to get a jump on this, and before anybody complains about the use of a composite, this is a 3D print of a complete cranium from Australopithecus africanus, a very closely related species, and there is no reconstruction or filling in of anything here. Hopefully you can appreciate the similarities and know that this composite was not created on an eyeballing it method. I want you to see the female as well, and also to appreciate the characteristics which continue over, and also the new characteristics that arise in the face and neurocranium of Australopithecus afarensis. The first and most obvious, I hope, is that the brain is significantly larger, even though this is a male and this is a female. In addition, the canines have stayed small, the palate has gotten deeper, and that mid-facial prognathism has reduced further still. Just like with Australopithecus anamensis, there is a whole host of minute measurements with regard to the face, neurocranium, and dentition that pulls Australopithecus afarensis further in the direction of humans as compared to earlier hominids like Paralopithecus or even early hominins like Anamensis, which came directly before it. I'll include those so you can see that in addition to the characteristics that are very obvious and easy to see on camera with a model as we see these changes evolve over time. So I've put a couple of additional crania up here just so you can see the slow evolution of the face, and then I'll tell you going on under the hood, we see a similar evolution of the dentition and of course with the neurocranium, but just so you can see with regard to the face, since that's what Peter Line was talking about, we have Paralopithecus, Australopithecus, Australopithecus, Homo, Homo, and Homo. So while it's true to say that Australopithecus has a more ape-like face than Homo that comes later, it's not correct to say that there's nothing about these faces that looks human at all. But what's important to remember about Peter Line's statement is that he's not really talking about the faces of these Australopiths, is he? He's talking about the skulls.
There's nothing really human looking at. If you look at the skull, there's nothing really human about it. It's very apish.
The hole at the base of the skull, or the foramen magnum, is a part of the skull. And I think it's pretty obvious that for knuckle-walking quadrupeds like chimps versus obligate bipeds like humans, there is quite a gulf here. So, if humans evolved from something that was, in a locomotor sense, more similar to chimps roughly 7 million years ago, shouldn't we see the emergence of this position and angle from this one? I'm going to use Australopithecus africanus for this, since this is a complete fossil, again, with nothing filled in, so there's no wiggle room here. The pallets are level, so let's see where the foramen magnum of this particular Australopith falls. And there we have it. It's hard to get more intermediate than that, I think. Here is the older Anamensis, and we have the foramen magnum again in a similar place to Africanus. And what the heck, here's Homo habilis. And just for comparison's sake, we see that migration from Australopithecus into the earliest members of genus Homo.
There's nothing really human looking at. If you look at the skull, there's nothing really human about it. It's very apish.
In some, that's not a fair representation of the hominin fossil record. Not even close. And it seems like minutia, but it's important to point out because, remember, evolution doesn't just predict that we should see the slow accumulation of more human-like characteristics over time. It requires it. The fact then that we see small characteristics in the face, brain case, and teeth of Australopiths as we move through the geologic column that look more human-like isn't just a significant point, it is the significant point, and it cannot be hand-waved away. Next, Peter Line invokes Charles Oxnard again and doubles down on that concept he pitched earlier.
I tend not to call them apes because, like some evolutionists who have studied them, like Oxnard, didn't classify them as ape. They were kind of different from African apes as well as humans.
I talk a lot about speaking outside of your area of expertise on this channel, and I talk about how you can do it, but you better do your research first because it's dangerous. This is the kind of thing that I'm talking about with Dr. Line here. Dr. Line, I am sure, is very well versed in his field of neuroanatomy and neurology generally, but what he just said there is incorrect in a way that my freshman business majors could recognize. There are two different categories that fall under the ape umbrella. The first is Hominidae. That's the family of great apes that we recognize today, and it includes humans and chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas and orangutans. And this is the category that used to be split up into two subcategories, Hominidae and Pongidae. Hominidae including just humans, Pongidae including everything else. If you'll recall, genetics absolutely blew that to smithereens, and so now we lump everybody together into a single great ape family, Hominidae. But there is a superfamily that exists immediately above that called Hominoidea, the regular old apes, all of the apes, whether you're a great ape, which are Hominidae, or a lesser ape, Hylobatidae, the gibbons and the siamangs. Now, according to Terry Harrison, one of the experts on early hominoids, the term hominoidea, at least as we can see in this monstrous textbook, Cenozoic Mammals of Africa, in his chapter on the origin of hominoids, well, the term hominoidea can be traced back to approximately 1825 by Gray. For the record, that precedes Darwin by over 25 years. And Oxnard knew this. You can find a passage from the paper that Peter Line is citing here, that 1975 paper that acknowledges that Australopiths are hominoids, apes, just like humans, and just like the other great apes. So I think Dr. Line needs to brush up on his terminology and on his taxonomy, because it doesn't matter where you put Australopithecus with relation to humans. Both humans and Australopiths always hash out to be hominoids or apes. And it doesn't matter who you ask or when you ask it, evidently, after 1825. The whole thing is very weird because Line acknowledges that Australopith crania are quite different from non-human African apes like chimps and gorillas. And then he's like, and that's why we should consider them to be apish primates.
And you can see that some of the skulls, they're not like chimpanzees. And so I call them apish primates.
That's a strange thing to say after just finishing telling us that Australopith crania are very apish and that there's nothing really about them that looks humanish.
If you look at the skull, there's nothing really human about it. It's very apish.
So are they apish or are they not? Even then, it doesn't matter though, because regardless of whether they're like African apes or not, they would still be considered hominoids or apes. At long last, we reach the bipedalism stuff with relation to genus Australopithecus, and Dr. Line kicks it off with this.
Evolutionists say they were upright walkers. They walk upright. And in some ways, that if you look at their pelvis and the femur, the thigh bone in some of them, it was kind of angled more inward, so that they likely walk better upright than existing chimps.
So yes, Australopithecus as a genus did walk better upright than existing chimps. So do humans. Line's characterization of it there obscures the whole story. In fact, it obscures the vast majority of the story with regard to what we know about Australopithecus and how this genus walked. Remember, we have thousands of specimens assigned to hundreds of individuals, representing everything from fragments of teeth to nearly complete skeletons. We have a really good idea as to what Australopithecus as a genus looked like and how they moved. We also, across thousands of years of investigation, have a pretty good idea as to the anatomy of humans and how humans move and how those two things fit together. Because of this, we know that genus Australopithecus has all of the characteristics that allow humans to be bipedal. They have that forwardly placed foramen magnum that we talked about earlier. We know they held their bodies upright. We know they had the S-shaped spine that humans have. We know they had a valgus knee, or a knee that comes at an angle to hold the weight in a singular column. We know that they had a bowl-shaped pelvis with sagittally oriented ilia. We know that their ilium and ischium alike on either side of the pelvis was shorter than what we see in all other non-human apes. We know that they have an inline big toe and 3 arches in the foot, just like us. And, if I may, we could go into countless minutiae down to muscle attachment sites like the anterior inferior iliac spine or the linea aspera to investigate how the muscles of these animals attached and how it facilitated the same bipedalism that we see in humans. But Dr. Line hand waves most of those characteristics. He doesn't really touch them, and instead he looks at existing apes and he's like, some of them walk upright sometimes. Like, for example, gibbons. This is going to be the position that he fleshes out. Like, okay, maybe if you look at some of the anatomy of Australopithecus, it does look a little bit like something that was walking around upright sometimes, but not all the time, and not like people.
A lot of these Australopithecines seem to have been have a tree-dwelling lifestyle. They were designed for an arboreal lifestyle, but if they left the trees, then they could likely walk upright too, but not like humans. All existing apes can also walk upright. It's just a matter of the degree, so...
In sum, Line is pointing out that all other non-human apes can, and in fact do, walk upright sometimes. In fact, I would add to that virtually all primates can walk upright a little bit. Line is saying that, okay, Australopiths are kind of like that, but a little bit better. They're upright more often than any other primate that isn't a human that is alive today, but nowhere close to what humans do. And he goes on to cite one of my favorite examples, which is the bipedalism that we see sometimes in gibbons.
But even today, there's other apes that walk better than chimps. Like actually, gibbons are the most proficient bipedal apes. They're the less apes.
Okay.
And they can run quite well too. If you've ever seen it run, they can run pretty fast. So walk upright. They have a better posture, their anatomical posture, also for upright walking than actually chimps have or any of the great apes. But they spend most of their times in the trees. So walking upright or whatever is good for actually living in the trees as well.
Right. So the idea then is that what Australopithecus is doing isn't that different than what gibbons are doing today, which is spending most of their time in the trees upright, but then coming to the ground very, very rarely. And that's what we're seeing in Australopithecus. Not a transition from something that is arboreal to something that is on the ground all the time, but something like a gibbon that is very, very occasionally coming to the ground, and it has an anatomy that is already well suited for being upright in the trees. That means that when it comes to the ground, it necessarily has to walk upright, but it is not an adaptation towards upright walking more often than what we've seen before. We can test that by looking at the anatomy of gibbons and comparing it to the anatomy of Australopithecus and the anatomy of humans, and seeing which one Australopithecus looks more like, obligately bipedal humans or very, very occasionally bipedal gibbons. Australopithecus looks like humans, and it's not even close. We can look at the feet, we can look at the legs, we can look at the pelvis, we can look at the arms, we can look at the rib cage. Even the posture, which is informed by the location and angle of the foramen magnum, betrays the locomotor style of Australopithecus, and how much more like humans it is. It's not even close. So incidentally, this is why I have all of these models, because I have a hylobatid cranium. This is a female siamang, so we can just flip this over and take a look at the location of that foramen magnum, just for comparison. Since these things are more bipedal than chimpanzees, but not as much as humans, we've got a nice little setup for comparison here. So here's our chimpanzee. We make sure that these pallets are level to take a look, and, well, I hope what you can see is that the foramen magnum is slightly more anterior in gibbons as compared to chimps, but not by much. It's perhaps even more clear when we make sure these pallets are level and look at the gibbon, or again, siamang, to be pedantic in comparison to a human, especially if we compare it to something like Australopithecus, which has a much more anterior and forwardly angled foramen magnum as compared to something like a gibbon. So what Line says here...
A lot of these Australopithecines seem to have been, have a tree-dwelling lifestyle. They were designed for an arboreal lifestyle, but if they left the trees, then they could likely walk upright too, but not like humans.
Cannot be argued. That's just not a feasible position to have, because we have the full anatomy of modern gibbons who are rarely bipedal, of modern humans who are virtually always bipedal, and of Australopithecus. And we can compare it, and it's way more similar to humans than it is to gibbons. So no, it did not lead a lifestyle like gibbons. What makes gibbons so interesting and important to human evolution, however, is that they do have an upright posture when they're in the trees, and when they come to the ground, they walk upright. So evolutionarily speaking, over long periods of time, what would happen if you had an ape that was always upright in the trees, and then the trees went away? Well, you would have an evolutionary pressure towards more efficient bipedalism, wouldn't you? And that is what is reflected in the fossil record. We have upright apes that are spending the majority of the time in the trees, and as time passes, as we move more recently through the geologic column, we see these same apes with this same upright posture accumulate more and more efficient characteristics for bipedalism on the ground, and then eventually full-time bipedalism. That doesn't mean that all of those hominins moved exactly like us, and it certainly doesn't mean that they didn't still spend time in the trees. Again, look at humans and our alien example from earlier. We have a fully committed terrestrial bipedal lifestyle, and we're still pretty good in the trees. Our host seems to grasp the significance of this.
So we can see why having the ability to walk upright would just be helpful for them in general. They might not necessarily have done that the majority of the time.
Except if they did, that would have some pretty important evolutionary implications, right? And they did do that the majority of the time, if their anatomy is anything to go off of, which it tends to be. We can also just look at their paleo environments, which are pretty easily reconstructed by the fossil assemblage that's there. They didn't live in dense forests like orangutans and gibbons do. They didn't even live in forests like chimpanzees and gorillas do. The places where Australopiths lived are either very patchy scrubland, savanna areas, or they're broken up by very small patches of forest, not places where they could spend anywhere close to the majority of their time in the trees, just functionally the trees weren't there. Then Peter says something that, again, I think is completely indefensible.
But does the evolution story bring Australopithecines into this because of that ability?
Yeah, it's because of that. But I doubt they were even obligate or habitual.
So I just went over all of the anatomical characteristics that Australopiths share with humans that tell us for sure that when these things were on the ground, they were walking upright in a manner that was fairly similar to humans, more similar to humans than any other living ape. The question, of course, then becomes, how much time did they actually spend on the ground? And we can answer this question, at least in part, by looking at the remodeling of bone in some of these guys, looking at the femoral necks and looking at the curvature of the fingers, as well as the environments that they live in. Again, for some of our Australopith species, there just aren't enough trees in the environment that they literally inhabited for them to spend all their time, or even most of their time, in the trees. So from the environments that these guys lived in and the way that their bones have remodeled, we know that Australopiths like Australopithecus afarensis were quite literally walking around on 2 feet on the ground a lot of the time. But as I said, Peter Line is going to not really touch the vast majority of that anatomy, and instead he's going to focus on the portions of Australopith anatomy that he feels are incongruous with a consistently terrestrial bipedal locomotor lifestyle for these guys.
If you look at say Lucy's sacrum, the thing that joins the 2 hip bones together, and you look at the top, the vertebra, the centrum, where the spine, the vertebral column, the lumbar region joins the sacrum. This is very small, which indicates that it pretty couldn't take probably the loads of a fully upright walking lifestyle. So it couldn't have spent that much time on it because it probably get all sorts of back problems.
Nope. According to the biomechanics literature, that small centrum or top portion of the sacrum for Australopiths wouldn't have impacted their ability to walk upright. It would have impacted their ability to run upright in an endurance fashion. Biomechanically, walking and running are very different things. When you walk, you strike with your heel and you roll your weight through your foot and then you push off and transfer that weight over again. It's sort of like a bowling ball on top of stilts rolling over and being caught by the stilts each time. Running is a high impact activity where you're sort of pogo sticking from leg to leg. There's a lot of force being applied up each leg and to the pelvis as you run. It's quite different from walking. Australopiths likely wouldn't have been capable of the same type of long-distance walking or high-speed bursts of running that modern humans are. They probably also couldn't carry heavy loads as they walked, but their entire anatomy, in addition to the cortical bone distribution of their femoral neck, tells us that they were capable of very frequent short-term upright walking and that they did engage in frequent short-term upright walking. When I say short term here, I don't mean that they could only walk upright a little bit each day. I mean that when they walked upright, they couldn't do it for hours and hours and hours as modern humans can. Instead, they could walk upright just as frequently as we can. They likely just couldn't sustain it for as long as we can. And boy, that kind of sounds like what you would expect for an animal that evolved bipedalism to move from tree patch to tree patch as their environment changed, doesn't it? To be clear, the ability to walk upright in small bursts very efficiently necessarily precedes the ability to walk upright in long bursts efficiently.
And also some of them they had kind of the hip bones, the iliac blades sort of more flared sideways. So the muscles, the gluteal muscles, probably couldn't balance the body properly as they walked. So they wouldn't have walked in a human-like way. And other studies have shown that they wouldn't have walked that efficiently. So
nope. Again, Australopiths were very efficient walkers for those short bursts. Some have even proposed that the unique aspects of their anatomy, such as that flared pelvis, allowed them to sort of approach the human level of efficiency for that short burst walking without having our precise ilium anatomy. What's weird about that is the flared pelvis, if anything, increases the surface area for the gluteal muscles to actually attach. The efficiency and endurance capabilities of Australopiths are outlined in very precise detail by Herman Ponzer, who is one of the leading folks when it comes to researching metabolism of living humans and then looking at how that applies to extinct hominins. According to his 2017 paper, Australopiths and early members of genus Homo are classified as having a good economy but limited endurance when it comes to walking. This is in comparison to earlier hominins and extant apes who have poor economy and low endurance for walking, and humans who are even more efficient and have a higher endurance.
So I don't know, it's a sort of semantics how much they walked upright, and it's really probably not that important, but for some people, they get too caught up in it.
So neither of the characteristics that he listed to sort of dampen the bipedal capabilities of Australopithecus actually do that. But moreover, it's not semantics. That is the point. The slow emergence of first bipedalism in general and then human-like bipedalism, that former ability being honed over time by natural selection, is the prediction that evolutionary theory makes and that creationism for decades and decades and decades has told us we will never see. So it's not semantics, it's very, very important. And our host here recognizes this.
Well, if they're trying to say that this is an ancestor of modern humans, would they then try and say that even with those abilities, at some point, mutations, natural selection meant that that ability improved? Is that the story?
Yeah, that's the thing.
He just doesn't really reckon with that. Instead, he pivots to talking about Miocene apes.
What I don't like to promote so much is that I've found sort of apes in Europe, like I think it's called Davinius guggensmosi, or I don't know if I got the name right.
I've listened to him say that a dozen times.
Davinius.
And I am not sure what he's saying here. The hominid that he's looking for is Danuvius guggensmosi, but it kind of sounds like he's saying Danuvius, and it kind of sounds like he's saying Darwinius, which is from the same sort of general European area and is a much earlier adapted primate.
Davinius.
It doesn't really matter. We know what he's talking about, but for your sake, it is Danuvius guggensmosi.
I think from Bavaria, Germany, an ape dated, a baboon-sized ape dated about, in their timeline, 11.62 million years ago. So that's millions of years before Australopithecus lived, where there were no ape men. So this was an ape man. And the people who analysed that skeleton say that was a habitually upright walker. But mainly for the trees, it was a tree-dwelling ape, but it was habitually upright walking. It had the body designed for that.
So Danuvius guggensmosi is a Miocene ape from Europe from, as Line said, about, call it 11 million years ago, who's proposed to have used a type of locomotion that we don't see at all in any species today, called arboreal extended limb clambering. It is not the type of bipedalism proposed for Australopithecus, nor is it the type of bipedalism proposed for Ardipithecus before it, or Auroran before it, or Sahelanthropus before it. If the authors are correct in their interpretation here, and there are paleoanthropologists who argue that they are not, that Danuvius' locomotor style does not seem to be sufficiently different from other Miocene apes living around the area at the time, it would be like one step towards human-level bipedalism, barely distinct from the other Miocene apes, but distinct enough. And we know this because of the preserved anatomy that we have. It doesn't look like Australopithecus, or like Ardipithecus, or like Auroran, or like Sahelanthropus, or like any hominin, which is why it's accepted as a hominid. And it's also just not true at all to say that paleoanthropologists or paleoprimatologists don't like to talk about this, because it's everywhere, all the time. Everybody who studies Miocene apes, and I know all the people who study Miocene apes, know about Danuvius and what's proposed for it, and the arguments for that, and the arguments against it. It's also very common knowledge that this is nowhere close to the type of bipedalism proposed for hominins, because we can compare that anatomy.
So even upright walking isn't a feature of ape men. So by their own people who analysed it, upright walking, fully upright walking habitually wasn't a ape man sign, because if you had apes already did that before they were ape men, how could it be? It doesn't make sense. So
if the fossil record was binary, as Peter Line is proposing here, then yeah, it wouldn't make any sense. If all our fossils were either human-like bipeds or nowhere close to that, then he would have a point. The problem is that is not at all anywhere close to what we see in the fossil record. The fossil record for the apes and for hominins shows us the following. First, we see the emergence of an upright posture in some of our middle to late Miocene apes. Then we see, in accordance with that upright posture, a couple of characteristics, just a handful, just a smattering of more efficient bipedal characteristics that allow you to be upright and then also move on those 2 feet. And this is in accordance with the disappearance of trees in these habitats. As the trees continue to disappear, we see hominins on the whole, this is the general trend, get more and more efficient at that upright walking until we see the acquisition of efficient running in the later members of genus Homo, eventually up to Homo sapiens. We see these physical morphologic changes in lockstep with the environmental changes around them. It's not fully bipedal or fully arboreal. There are a million steps in between those two categories, and that's what the fossil record displays for us. The slow acquisition of human-like bipedalism in walking and running from arboreal quadrupeds over roughly 15 to 20 million years of time. On the whole, Australopiths probably didn't walk exactly like us, but they were far more efficient bipeds than any non-human ape, near on the level of humans with regard to efficiency in walking. Current data suggests they weren't amazing runners. They could move easily on the ground or in the trees, a mosaic animal with mosaic bones found directly in between early Miocene apes and the later genus Homo, just as evolution predicted. To my knowledge, no one since the discovery of any substantial postcrania from genus Australopithecus has suggested that these guys weren't upright and that they weren't upright bipedal walkers when they were on the ground. Further, no one has ever suggested that their upright walking was as inefficient as chimps or gibbons. Instead, the bipedalism of genus Australopithecus precedes the bipedalism of genus Homo, an idea that's supported by the fact that characteristics that show up for the first time in Australopiths persist through early, middle, and late genus Homo, through hominins that Peter Line would accept as human. Still, Line's idea that Australopiths were at the very least bipedal when they came to the ground is more scientifically grounded than the overwhelming majority of creationists that I've encountered here online, with a couple of exceptions. And believe it or not, one of the better models comes from Donny Deals. Yup, the same YouTube creationist Donny Deals, who for years has insisted that Australopithecus isn't actually bipedal. This is something that he actually fought with one of my favorite creationists, Peter of Teleologos, about many years ago. And no, I don't know what it is about the name Peter and being a creationist that makes you more reasonable with regard to hominin evolution. It seems like if your name is Peter and you're also a creationist, you're just going to have a better perspective on this stuff than if you're a creationist with a different name. I can't explain it. With the exception of the name Donald Deals, I guess, because Donny's model is, with the exception of Peter of Paleologos, the best creationist model with regard to hominins that I've seen yet. And of course, that's due to its similarity to conventional science. I'm gonna let him explain it to you first.
Okay, we understand environment can dictate morphology. We understand that we have shifts in environment in both the creation and evolution models, because in the creation model, we have the pre-flood world, which is 95% green, which is lush. You have much vegetation, massive trees, and you can have these pre-flood ape-like primate creatures existing in trees, being well adapted to arboreal lifestyles, okay? But still with that front-loaded adaptability, where if they move into new environments, their morphology can shift in minor ways based on environmental stimuli or stressors. And so you get the immediate post-flood world, the real estate is greatly altered. The environments rapidly shift in chaotic ways. And you have an immediate post-flood ice age. This is everything in a nutshell, but an immediate post-flood ice age. And then you have shifts in environment to more, we have these creatures existing in grassland environments. And so now their morphology can shift in ways where we see mosaic traits, not necessarily related to evolution or these being transitional forms, but being mosaic because the environment and the rapid shifts in environment post-flood and post-flood ice age actually have acted upon these various morphological traits with the diversity built in.
They evolved. That's Donny's explanation for hominins like Australopithecus. They evolved for more basal arboreal apes. And the reason they evolved, or shifted, as he says, is due to the environment. In the pre-flood world, it was very forested. And in the post-flood world, it became more grassland-like. And so the built-in variation that they had allowed them to shift along with the environment from a more arboreal ape to a more terrestrial ape.
You know, and I'm not judging you, but I'm just saying everybody else is gonna.
What do I even do with this, right? I mean, first of all, well done, Donny. That is leaps and bounds better than virtually every other creationist out there. Again, with the exception of Peter of Paleologos. But that's because that's just what the conventional science says, right? You're allowing for the evolution of these characteristics in Australopiths from earlier Miocene apes, but instead of being across millions of years and due to slow changes in the environment, it's within like a couple of 100 years, and due to rapid changes in the environment due to a globe-spanning flood. Now, there are a couple of pretty critical differences. First, Donny thinks that the ability to evolve these more bipedal characteristics was like built into these animals at creation. So when God created the Australopith kind, they were actually all arboreal, like they were basically the Miocene apes. But hidden dormant within their genomes was the ability to take on more bipedal terrestrial characteristics in case the environment changed. We don't see that in animals today. When we sequence the genomes of critters, we don't see like hidden upgrades in their genome just waiting to be activated. Instead, we see mutations emerge that if they are beneficial, they are selected, and that's how populations change over time. So this front-loaded DNA thing, that is a non-falsifiable hypothesis, and it is thus not scientific. Perhaps more importantly, and this is the one that blows my mind, he's allowing for the changes that occur between earlier Miocene apes and hominins to happen. Arboreal apes to terrestrial bipedal apes. He's cool with that. But the musculoskeletal changes that have to happen to go from arboreal ape to terrestrial bipedal ape, that number is greater than the amount of musculoskeletal changes that have to happen to get an Australopith to a human. Right? Like the bones and muscles are all already there for Australopithecus to humans, or virtually all already there. The architecture is almost completely set from Australopithecus afarensis to humans. It's just changes in the shapes and sizes of bones that are already there. Of course, the same is true from Miocene apes to Australopiths, but the actual magnitude of those changes is greater in that span than it is from Australopiths to humans, which is why I don't understand how he says this.
And I'm just talking about minor shifts, okay? It's not like these Australopithecines in the pre-flood world looked like extant apes today. No, different kinds altogether. I'm just saying the traits within these features, or within the anatomy, like the pelvis, you can get these minor shifts where it kind of takes on more of a mosaic look, but because that is demanded by the shifts in environment. And epigenetics obviously would have a part to play as well.
Right, so the environment is causing pre-flood arboreal Australopiths, or what I'm assuming are the Miocene apes, unless I'm incorrect there, to evolve into terrestrial bipedal Australopiths after the flood. That's just evolution, and that is a ton of major musculoskeletal changes to allow within such a short amount of time and to allow within a created kind. Again, the differences between an Australopith and a human, I think, are less than the differences between something like Proconsul and Akembo to Australopithecus. So I know you're wondering, and we're going to cover this before we get back to Peter Line here, what then separates Australopithecus, or the Australopith kind, from the human kind in Donny's model here? Like, if the Australopiths that we have are in fact, as conventional science pitches them, they're these pretty committed terrestrial bipeds who still spend some time in the trees, how does Donny actually parse them out as not actually related to humans? What is the clear delineation there? Well, in quick summary, it's the hyoid bone, and Australopiths have a longer ischium than humans do. That's what separates them out. Given the amount of change that Donny allows, presumably based off of what he said here, from Miocene apes to Australopiths, or even just from Ardipithecus to Australopiths in the ilium and ischium measurements, I don't really think he can use the ischium as a deciding factor because it falls within the range of change that could occur within his own model, going from the Australopith ischium length to the human ischium length.
In my article, I have a whole section on it. I went through the Stern and Sussman 1983 paper in great detail, spent hours and hours on it, and then comparing that to other papers on the topic. But it was very clear that that paper showed that Lucy had a long hamstring moment arm, and that functionally indicates a long projecting ischium, posteriorly projecting ischium. which makes sense. Extant apes, longer ischium, your Australopithecines, which with some debate in Sediba having the long ischium as well. The Van Sickle et al. Paper, 2018, I believe it is. I've actually got it pulled up. I can show you. That demonstrated that Africanus and also Afarensis had a relatively long ischium and pubis compared to modern humans.
It depends on how you actually measure the ischium, as there are several different means by which to assess this bone relatively and absolutely, but the ischium of Australopiths is far more similar to humans in overall length than it is to other non-human apes today. That is just a fact. Far more similar does not mean identical, and again, I'm not proposing that Australopiths walk identically to how modern humans do. Instead, they occupy a very clear intermediate in the majority of traits, with many traits actually being far more similar to humans than other great apes, and the ischium and really the entire pelvic complex is one of those characters. That Stern and Sussman paper is an awesome paper, and I'm glad Donny read it. It really cements the fact that Australopiths were definitely bipedal on the ground, and probably in their own way that is similar to humans but not identical to it. However, when they talk about the long nature of the ischium, again, they're talking about how Australopith ischia are long compared to human ischia. They're not like other great ape ischia, though. They're way more like humans than they are like other great apes, but they're still a little bit long compared to humans, at least generally speaking. So to be clear, the ischium is not going to do it. But what about the other character, the hyoid bone? The hyoid is a small bar-shaped bone that sort of sits up under and behind your mandible. It is the only bone in the human body that does not directly articulate with any other bones, and instead it's held in place by soft tissue. It's primarily implicated in swallowing mechanics, but some people have proposed that the hyoid and the shape of the hyoid in humans may have something to do with our ability to speak. We have very few fossil hyoids. I believe the number is 5. 2 of them are Neanderthals. 2 of them belong to the Cima de los Huesos specimen, so whatever you want to call those, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis, or just late members of genus Homo. And then we have 1 Australopith hyoid, and it belongs to a kid. It's the Dikika-child hyoid, so it is not fully developed. So 4 of our fossil hominin hyoids are under 1 million years old, and 1 is an Australopith hyoid or older than that. When we look at the morphology of these hyoids, the modern hyoids, of course, look almost identical to the hyoids we see in modern humans, or within that range of variation, and the Dikika-child hyoid looks like the hyoid bone that we might see in any great ape, or I should say African great ape. It looks more similar to chimpanzees or gorillas. So Donny's argument is going to be, and I'm going to let him spell it out for you here in a second, that we see no transitional hyoids, and since the hyoid is implicated in language, that is how you tell the difference between the human kind and the Australopith kind.
The only known hyoid bone from Australopithecus afarensis, the same species as Lucy, is chimp-like, not human-like. It has the bulla and air sac features of apes, not the slender speech-adapted structure of humans. That's not a transitional trait, that's a categorical distinction. The fossil record still lacks any hyoid showing a stepwise evolution toward human speech anatomy.
This is mostly correct. The bulla is present in the Dikika-child's hyoid bone, but the air sacs are inferred on the basis of the morphology of the hyoid bone. That last bit about the categorical stuff, that's not true, as you're going to see here in a second, but I want to let him lay it out just a little bit deeper for you. And I'm going to speed him up again because I'm going to let him talk for just a minute.
So-called hominins like Neanderthals, Erectus, and Heidelbergensis had sophisticated speech like we do today, which separates us from the animal kingdom. Okay, but then when you look at the Australopithecines, what we know about their hyoid is it's ape-like, separating us even more from the Australopithecines and extant apes. Where's the transitional form that shows the gradual development of a human-style hyoid capable of complex speech? What fossil evidence documents that intermediate stage?
So he wants a hyoid transitional specimen, something that is in between the Dikika-style hyoid bone that we see that is more indicative of chimps, gorillas, and bonobos, and the more modern hyoid that we see like 2+ million years later in Neanderthals and in Homo sapiens. And that's important because the hyoid bone is linked to language, and if you have a human-like hyoid bone, you can speak. And if you have a chimp or gorilla-like hyoid bone, you can't. And that's a big categorical difference that can't be bridged by evolutionary change, right? That language bit, that's the critical piece to his argument here.
Given that the hyoid bone is critical for speech and language, can you identify any fossil showing an intermediate morphology between the ape-like, boa-shaped hyoid of Australopithecines and the modern human bar-shaped hyoid? Because so far, the fossil record seems to jump from one to the other with no gradation.
Well, we have 5 hyoids, and there's millions of years in between them, so I can tell you that it does seem like there's a jump here, right? It does appear that way, and there isn't a hyoid that seems to bridge the gap between the Dickicka-Childs hyoid and the Cima-Delos Huesos hyoids. That's critical to Donny's argument here because
the hyoid bone is the anchor for human speech, and the fossil record gives us only 2 designs, ape-like and human-like. Nothing in between. Australopithecus had the former. Homo and Neanderthals had the latter. There's no fossil showing an anatomical bridge between them, no protohyoid or transitional vocal tract. The data fits discrete design forms, not a continuous evolutionary path.
Donny's argument here hinges on the human hyoid shape being related to language and the non-human ape hyoid shape being related to the inability to speak. Right? Now, we know that there is a lot of diversity in human hyoid shape, a lot more than tends to be appreciated if you buy a hyoid model, because it's just kind of a variable looking bone. But it is fair to say that all of the human hyoids that we have would group together to the exclusion of all of the chimp hyoids or all of the gorilla hyoids that we have. But if it is that bar shape to the human hyoid that is required for human speech, that is a critical prerequisite for speech and language. And that fact, that relationship is required for Donny's prediction and model to make sense here. Then one other thing must be true, right? We must not find the human-shaped hyoid in any other apes that we know can't speak. Because if we did, if we found that humanish looking hyoid bone in apes that cannot talk, that would mean that that shape specifically is not intrinsically necessarily related to speech and language, right? And that would mean that Donny's argument here doesn't work, that that categorical difference can't stand, yeah? Because one, it would mean that that bar-like hyoid shape is not unique to humans, meaning it is not in a one-to-one relationship with speech and language. And two, it would mean that that shape is actually just within the reach of evolution, right? Oh, what's this hyoid bone that's been slowly appearing? That is an orangutan hyoid. Yeah, I've told Donny this before, but one of my buddies studies hyoid bones specifically, and he studies them specifically with relation to swallowing biomechanics. So after watching his dissertation defense, where he talked a little bit about how human hyoids and orangutan hyoids look pretty similar, I asked him to send me one of his models because they're notoriously difficult to find online. And yes, they do have that bar-like human shape, don't they? The last time I checked, orangutans don't speak or have language. Last time I checked, anyways. This does not mean that the hyoid bone shape in humans has nothing to do with our ability to speak, but it does mean that the human-like hyoid shape is not exclusively implicated in language. It means that you can't use it as the sole demarcation of speech. The orangutan hyoid kind of kills Donny's argument here outright. So I know what you're asking. Why does the orangutan hyoid look like that? And the reason is really interesting. Some people have proposed, and again, my buddy is looking into topics adjacent to this, that the hyoid is far more important to swallowing than it is to things like speech, and that maybe that bar-shaped hyoid that we see in humans and that we also see in orangutans is perhaps related to our more upright posture. That swallowing, when you have an upright posture, requires a more bar-like hyoid rather than the big bulla that we tend to see in chimps and gorillas, who knuckle walk on all fours. Speech is related to a vast network of different incorporated hard and soft tissues in the human jaws and throat. So boiling it down to just hyoid shape, it's not going to work. This is an area that we're continuing to research, but I think at this point we do know that hyoid shape alone cannot tell you if something was capable of speech or not. What's so odd to me, though, is that after saying that the hyoid and the ischium length are means by which to distinguish the Australopith kind from the human kind, he starts to talk about how his model is better, and it is better than the overwhelming majority of other creationist models because it takes like a more holistic approach, which he describes like this.
And this is when we take the holistic approach. This is what we can see. We're not just taking one isolated feature and saying, well, the curved phalanges, the curved fingers show that the Australopithecines were non-human apes. No, that doesn't work, because then the evolutionists can point to the curved fingers or phalanges in Hobbit or Naledi.
He's right to point this out. Creationists in the past have said, look, Australopiths have curved fingers, long arms, and shoulders that are oriented more dorsally or superiorly upward, so they can climb a lot better than modern humans can. And that's how we can actually tell the difference between the human kind and just any other old ape or the Australopith kind. And Donny is saying here that doesn't work because hominins that we require to be human, like Homo naledi or Homo floresiensis, the hobbit, also have those characteristics. Because of this, it is in the creationists' best interest, if you want to make a feasible model, to take the whole skeleton into account. But then he continues.
But we're not just taking a single feature, we're taking a holistic, sophisticated approach where when we have enough of the material of these creatures, we can tell what is an ape and what isn't. And so taking a holistic approach tells us what? Well, anatomically, Australopithecines weren't halfway between ape or human, or a better way is just saying transitional. They were not our ancestors. They were a distinct kind altogether. Their curved fingers, ape-like shoulders, small brains, and even the presence of a baculum. That is inferred, though, so we don't have to take that one as gospel. Put them closer to modern chimps than to us. Their hyoid bone proves they vocalize like apes, not humans. Every key system, locomotion, reproduction, dentition, and speech, shows discontinuity, not descent. Remember I say, especially when it comes to genetics, it's the differences that make all the difference. Well, that also goes for fossils, for bones. That's not a chain of evolution. That's a pattern of separate design.
He's like, when you take the holistic approach and look at the arms, fingers, shoulders, and hyoid, that's what tells you that these things are actually just apes. They're an Australopith kind, and they're not members of the human kind, and they certainly don't link the two together. He also adds a bit about the baculum and says that that's inferred. That is completely made up. There is absolutely nothing that gives us any indication that Australopiths had a baculum, and in fact, everything suggests that they probably didn't, because the baculum that we see in our closest living relatives, chimpanzees, is like the size of your thumbnail. It's teeny tiny. It's already on the way out by 7 million years ago. But that's just so strange to me that he would say we have to take the whole animal into account. And when we do, well, yeah, it's fully bipedal when it's on the ground. And yeah, the environment tells us for many of them that they were spending most of their time on the ground. And yeah, the brain case is bigger than the Miocene apes that came before. And yeah, the canines are reduced. But what about the hyoid? And it is just the hyoid, right? Because he just got done telling us why the curved fingers, long arms, and more dorsally oriented shoulder blades don't work as a means by which to delineate. So it is just the hyoid. So how is that a holistic approach again? Donny's model is much improved. Obviously, I really like that. He now accepts that Australopiths were necessarily bipedal when they were on the ground and that they probably spent a lot of time on the ground. That's good. He didn't previously accept that. Now he does. That is improvement. But his means by which to parse out this new Australopith kind of his don't work because the human-like hyoid bone cannot clock speech exclusively. The ischium of Australopiths is far more human-like than it is like anything else, and the long arms, curved fingers, and more dorsally oriented scapulae are found in what are ostensibly, obviously, humans. So Donny, great job. This is a big, big step forward. But with all of what I just taught you in mind, and I assume that you're watching this, right? You said that you watched my other videos on these subjects. How do you actually distinguish the Australopith kind from the human kind? I'll tell you ahead of time, you can't. What you're going to find is that any singular character that you pick, there is going to be some member of genus Homo that has that character within the degree of the Australopith range, and vice versa. So originally, as you can probably tell from the first half of this video, I was going to finish going through Peter Line's interview here where he talks about Homo habilis and Homo erectus and sort of as a spoiler, he's going to say Homo habilis is just Australopithecus, incorrectly assigned, and then you can clearly demarcate Homo erectus and that sort of portion of genus Homo and then the rest of genus Homo from the Australopith kind. And I was going to get into that and why you can't actually do that. But a couple of things have happened. One, this video is already an hour and a half long. And two, a new Homo habilis partial skeleton has just been published. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop it here and we're going to separate out this Homo habilis stuff and get into why this hominin is legitimate and also the hominins that are closely related to it, like Homo rudolfensis and Homo georgicus, and why they pose a real problem to young Earth creationism and creationism generally. And this is going to be the most up-to-date reason why Homo habilis is so problematic, because I'm going to incorporate this newest partial skeleton into that analysis, since I haven't seen creationists really get into it yet. The Homo habilis stuff wasn't really the point of this video anyways. The point of this video was to point out that Peter Line went on Creation Ministries International's YouTube channel, one of the big three creationist organizations, and espoused a belief that yes, Australopithecus as a genus was bipedal sometimes, and it can't really be reconstructed as a knuckle-walking chimpanzee. This idea has also been adopted by internet young Earth creationists like Donny of Standing for Truth, who previously did not accept that Australopiths were terrestrial bipeds. Just like creationists accepting the conventional numbers for the human-chimpanzee genomic similarity, this is a really big deal. This is something, Australopiths being bipedal, that they have been railing against for over 100 years now. And yet here we have one of the big three creationist organizations sort of going, well, I guess maybe they were upright walkers. But that doesn't mean evolution is true, and it doesn't. But it is one piece of that puzzle, and in my opinion, it's a pretty big piece for reasons that I outlined over the past hour and a half. We'll see where this ends up going. If I had to guess, I would say Answers in Genesis isn't going to accept bipedal Australopiths until Ken Ham dies because of that exhibit. They put a lot of money into the position that it was just a knuckle-walking chimpanzee. But I do think that we will get there eventually. And once creationists accept that Australopiths were bipedal, which is again a critical difference, a critical bridge that needs to be crossed in the evolution of humans generally from Miocene ape-like ancestors, we can ask the question, well, okay, what will they accept next? And again, to be clear, this isn't an interpretive thing. The anatomy is what the anatomy is. It is a good thing and a correct thing that they are taking this position, even if they're putting their own creationist spin on it. But what if I told you that this is how it works for all the characteristics within human evolution? We'll see. If you like what I do, please consider supporting me on Patreon. And if you want to support me in the free way, you can leave likes, comments, and subscribe to this channel. It helps suggest my videos to people who might find it interesting. I want to thank you from the bottom of my gentle and, of course, very modern heart for being such a curious primate. And I'll see you real soon next time.